The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. When it comes to utility data, there's a common misconception that it's fixed and beyond your control. However, that's far from the truth. 360 Energy has created an innovative AI-powered platform designed to simplify and automate the complex process of energy and emissions data management. Introducing Envirely. Envirely provides organizations with a comprehensive solution enabling efficient management of energy usage, cost reduction, and greenhouse gas emissions reduction in alignment with global standards. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Really great to be back.
Well, Sandra, John, it is a real pleasure. The week just flew by, so I'm looking forward to this topic as well that we've got today.
Yeah.
And we have quite an exciting topic today, depending on what angle you look at it from. Today we're talking about energy invoices.
You know, I hope the audience stays with us because that may have just told them to leave after they heard energy invoices because no one actually even looks at them on why they want to look at them. So today, I think we want to talk about why they're so important, why you should look at them, and what to look at. So stay with us, folks. We'll try to keep this as exciting as possible so you understand why every month you should look at your utility invoices.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, why is the acquiring energy and carbon data from invoices crucial for businesses committed to sustainability goals?
I'll start up, John.
Okay.
And I'll use the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financial, it's called PCAF. It's actually a mechanism to score how accurate customers' data is to measure their carbon emissions. And a lot of this has to do, specifically the scoring, how you increase the scoring, relates to the quality of data that you capture to report. So I'll just lay this out for you. Currently, financial institutions, they really, when they get this information and they're reporting on behalf of their customers, they only need a score of 5. And what that means is effectively, it's not that accurate. It's just saying, okay, we think that this customer is in this location. The commodities that they use is this amount of money that they're spending. So we're guessing the carbon emissions is this, and they get a score of 5. And by the way, they have done their job. Financial institutions have done their job. But quite frankly, that does not move the dial for customers. Customers, they really don't, truthfully, that doesn't move them or get them to change their status or understanding where they are and what they need to do. So getting into the data, understanding what data to capture from a utility bill, how to use it is so important for customers so they understand their current status, when they take action, what changes occurred, and for them to see it. John, do you have anything you want to add or take away from that?
Yeah, I do. We've said this before, but typically 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are connected to energy. So if you aren't understanding fully how you're using energy, how can you account for your greenhouse gas emissions? That's one point. The other point I would bring forward is I get involved in third-party assurance of data for some very large organisations. And guess what? If you're reporting in your annual report your GHG emissions, at some point, if that energy has been bought through a normal transaction with an invoice, the audit trail has to go right the way back at some point to those invoices. So that's important. But I also want to liven things up a bit can we on invoices? But I want to liven things up a bit by saying we're focusing on this question about why you need to do it for sustainability. You actually need to do it for energy management, for financial management. There's a whole range of reasons why. I have never understood why people in an organisation will happily buy all sorts of items, stationery, toilet paper, God knows what else, and they will check off the invoice, make sure it was delivered right, and what price they paid for it. And then this invoice comes in from the utility company, and somehow they seem to glaze over, ignore it. It goes to the accounts department. They may or may not deal with it other than looking at it. How much money, what tax, when does it need to be paid by? And people are investing in very sophisticated systems to report carbon emissions. And yet a lot of it comes down to a piece of paper, be it physical paper or electronic paper, that's got facts on it. And that's the invoice, and that's why it's important.
So I want to pick up, John, what you're saying and just really reinforce this. We find 95% of the customers, if not higher, the only thing that they look on a utility bill is the dollar amount that they owe. That's it. They don't have mechanisms to capture any other data. And the part of that reason is the person's job, that's not their requirement. Their job is to pay for the bill. The other part, truthfully, is that most customers don't actually understand a utility bill and what to look at. And I want to come back to what you're saying. This is like, energy is completely controllable, and job one is to use the utility voices. Why most people think it's not controllable is they don't use the data and don't understand how to use it. And so that's why most customers don't deal with energy, quite frankly, because there's not an internal mechanism to actually capture it and measure it. Besides dollars, there's other items that need to be looked at. And as you say, John, this thing's got payback all over it if you put the proper mechanism in place.
Yeah, you can almost manage your invoices, have that pay for itself, and then all your sustainability reporting is, if you like, is a bit of a bonus, a bit of added value.
Exactly. It's a secondary issue. So you know the work that we have done when we talk about carbon emissions to people, there's two camps. One, some people run away because they think it's a cost thing that they don't want to deal with. The other half is they don't believe it. They don't think it's real. They think it's a fad. In Canada, if the carbon tax goes away, somehow carbon emissions goes away because they don't have to pay a carbon tax.
Yeah.
So really the idea is to focus, as you say, on energy, show the payback associated with it, make it controllable, and the side benefit is you get carbon emissions. It's actually a pretty thing to do, but we have to get customers to do it and to get excited about invoices.
That's the task.
Yeah.
Well, now that we got the why out of the way, which arguably is probably the most important thing for a business to define on this energy and carbon management journey, let's get into the what's. So my first what is, what hurdles do businesses face when seeking to obtain energy and carbon related data from invoices?
Okay, I'll kick off. Dave has already touched on one, and that is, do they actually understand the invoice? Now, let's just keep it relatively simple. Let's just talk about two utility supplies, one being natural gas, the other one being electricity. And you would think, well, that's got to be fairly straightforward. The problem is when we start with gas, the gas meter reads in cubic meters, not in energy. You have to know a calorific value. You have to put all that together. And from that, you then get an answer out. Now, fortunately, most utilities do actually run all the way through from the meter readings through to what the actual kilowatt hours are. But that's normally on page 2 of the invoice. Page 1 of the invoice is normally the one that's looked at, and it's the one that matters. So that, at one level, natural gas is relatively straightforward. But then when we move on to electricity, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, unless you are a very simple, low consumption customer on a single rate fixed tariff, you can get a very complicated set of paper. It has improved somewhat, but I know in the UK with some of the more sophisticated seasonal time of day tariffs, you've ended up with 10, 20 pages of an invoice. Who's going to deal with that? Why do I need to deal with that? Oh, look, page 1. It tells me what I've got to pay, when. Oh, it also tells me I paid last month's bill, so that's good. And it tells me what the tax is on it, so I can put it all in the accounts, and that's it. And that's done. So First problem is understanding what are the nuggets, what's the real information you want from that. And then the second one is a real biggie. It's how do you get that information from that invoice into your accounting system? And I'm just going to, I mean, there's a lot, I think, because I think Dave's going to come in on this for sure, but there's a lot of issues here. One of the classic approaches is that somebody has the paper or electronic paper invoice, and then they transcribe the figures from that into a spreadsheet. That can go wrong. That can go wrong. You can get all sorts of mispostings. And in fact, subject to a non-disclosure agreement, something I will say generally, I was looking at a major corporation recently that they got a very sophisticated system with macros, everything else, pulling data through from everything. And guess where there was a bit of a hiccup? It was getting the invoice data into the system. It had to be done manually. And whilst I'm on this particular one, here's something. Until it was audited, somebody, might have been myself, pointed out to them, oh, by the way, that invoice value that you're taking there, didn't you notice on the invoice it said it was an estimate, and that hadn't got flagged up in the system? So you've got that as a problem, knowing what the information is and then getting that information so you can use it. And I think I'll stop at that point. I know we're trying to do at least 15 minutes per question, just to wind Lysandra up a bit. But I'll pass it back to Dave.
Okay, so John, I'll make this 25 minutes with this question. So just to be clear, this is a problem worldwide. So invoicing, this isn't just a UK, Canadian issue. This is a worldwide problem. And I want to, for our listeners in North America, John was talking about how in natural gas, it's measured in kilowatt hours.
Of course,
North
you
America,
would be.
Yeah, we work with cubic meters or therms, and so that's a volume. It's not an energy content. So you have to be very mindful of that. So we are a little different. I think whatever it is, because no one's really been educated on the utility invoices. No one actually, it's not done in engineering schools. They don't teach how to read. In business schools, they don't teach how to read invoice. It's kind of a literacy thing. So it's not there. And because of that, it looks really complex. And maybe it is because if you haven't been taught that. So, we look at, there's probably 22 items on a utility bill that we look at to analyze. And John just mentioned there's probably two items that most customers look at. They look at dollars and they look at tax, and that's it. So, and then John nailed it as well, getting this data into a system. Now, I've always encouraged customers to try to incorporate more information into their financial systems, but their financial systems aren't set up to capture all the data that needs to be done. So then you've got to look at, as John said, a spreadsheet. You can manually put that in place, which, has been done for years. Probably in the last 5-10 years, optical, like if you're dealing with a multiple site organization, instead of hand bombing it, you're optically grabbing it. But I can tell you from our research and the work we do, that's only 60% accurate. So that's 40% that the data that you're putting in isn't right. So you have to go through it. So what does that mean? That means time and money. And most clients, again, don't realize the value behind that because they just see how much it costs. So there is significant value when you do it and do it right. Understanding what to do, grabbing the data, making sure the data is accurate, as John said, because John conveyed this as well. Sometimes utilities, they estimate bills. Sometimes their bills are incorrect. Sometimes. I think studies are showing, John, like from 1% to 3% error with utilities on bills. So most customers don't know that because they don't know what to look for. So there's a lot of stuff that what stops people, and we're saying to you, it's real value to do this and do this well, whether it's single site operation or multiple site, for sure.
Mm. Just to pick up on something, you mentioned therms, and of course therms are actually an energy measure, and I know
Yes,
that
yes.
was a misspeak. But what I find
Yeah.
amusing, a therm is 100,000 British thermal units, and the British thermal unit is not a legal unit in the United Kingdom. Yeah, but no, I think as well something we ought to mention here with this is there is a process that we sort of who deal with this regularly, we call invoice verification, which is checking that the invoice is correct against the tariff that was being charged and everything else. And I'm gonna throw just a little hand grenade in here. I am aware that we have somebody who may know something about the operation of utilities, but on this podcast, but I'm not having a go here. Anyway, what we get is that very often, and this is another reason why people don't engage with their invoices, lots of organisations will use a broker to handle their energy procurement and process the invoices. And they expect that the broker is dealing with all the issues of verification and everything else. So, as far as they're concerned, it's a job done. Now, brokers are like any other professionals. There's a spectrum from the absolutely superb to the I don't think you should use those guys. And it depends who you've got there. And that's one of the things, and what I find slightly concerning about it, I can understand why somebody wants to outsource a lot of the work involved in this, but at the same time, you end up, if you're not careful, distancing yourself from it. And I've questioned a number of people who got brokers and said, do they do invoice verification? And, well, what does that mean? How does that happen? And an example I saw recently, and it's funny, it's coming back to this estimated reading. There was a bill that had gone through, estimated reading through the broker, hadn't thought anything about this. Utility had used the profile for the previous year to put this forward. The previous year, this 6-story office block was fully occupied. This year, this 6-story office block has 2 security guards, and they estimated the consumption as being the same as the previous year. And the broker didn't really consider, because he looked at it and said, well, yeah, that follows the profile that we think. So that's being disconnected from it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the broker, John. It's a great point. So remembering, depending on the brokers, how they're paid,
Yes.
many of them are paid based on consumption. So the higher the consumption, the more money they make.
Yeah.
Right. So it depends on what drives them. So they may not want to correct things if it looks better for them. I do want to come back because I think we missed a really valuable point here, and that is because we're talking about energy, but we're also talking about so when you're getting this data, when you're capturing information and you're capturing consumption data, and you want to make sure that consumption data is real and not estimated for electricity. Each jurisdiction, the carbon content will be uniquely different depending on the generation makeup in that area. I bring this up because we work with some fairly large organizations and they'll use a global number. And I think that's a disservice to different jurisdictions. And why I'm saying that personally, because in Canada, if this organization's in Europe and they use a global number, in Canada, and especially on our electricity, we've got a very, very clean grid. And so you're penalizing a Canadian operation or an operation that has a really clean grid that actually could be advantageous to the corporation to create more production in that clean grid area as opposed to that it's really essential to really understand what jurisdiction you're in and what generation makeup you have in electricity and how it relates to the consumption as well.
Okay, I'm glad you raised that, because we that leads on to another point we can talk about that. When you're accounting for your emissions under the greenhouse gas protocol, electricity is regarded as scope 2. And under scope 2, there are 2 bases that you can report on, and this touches to exactly what you're saying. One is called location-based, and the other is called market-based. Now, the location-based would be one where you use national figures or, as opposed to the specific supplier. And many people find that their market-based emissions are far lower because they may have a power purchase agreement for renewable energy or something like that. So here's the question for you. You know, you might, when you struck the deal, you might know what the source is, but are you tracking what the generation sources are? Very often this information is on the invoice, but if you're going to claim when you're coming up for assured data and you're using your market-based calculation, you've got to actually demonstrate that you did buy that kind of power with that PPA or with those renewable origin certificates or whatever mechanism is in there. So what a lot of people are doing, first hit, and I agree with you, that first hit, and I can tell you, I've had this with a company that's doing it for the first time. They haven't got a clue where their electricity is coming from. So for their first footprint report, they're reporting it based on location. Now, there is a slight benefit in a way with both reporting, because what one says, if we were in this location and we were using the standard electricity, this is what our emissions would be. But because we're buying better electricity, this is how much better we are than if we weren't. So it's interesting that way. But again, it's one of the high level bits of carbon reporting. But guess what? You know, the supporting documentation comes back down to the utility agreement and the utility bills.
Now, John, you brought something up in so far in North American utility bills. I don't see us establishing how clean the electricity is in our monthly bills. So you just said something that you do in Europe that we don't do.
Yeah, you can even find it on domestic bills. They will have what the fuel mix of generation is that generator is using. And I think as we go forward, this is the kind of information that can start to educate the end user.
Agree. In fact, it sounds to me that's the best practice that should be put in place.
I think so.
So for all the regulators that listen to our podcast, you got some work to do.
Yeah, make it a requirement to disclose the generating mix on the invoice.
Yeah, next question. What are some procedural issues from trying to collect energy and carbon data from invoices, and how do they impact sustainability efforts?
Okay, it's maybe a little bit of what we've talked about before. The procedural is, when the bills come in, what do you capture from the bills? How do you collect that information from the bills? Who actually sees the data from the bills? Who has responsibility to look at? So, for example, in electricity, engineering would be interested in power factor correction. Mm-hmm. Do they ever see access to those bills? Do they ever see that? Operations, the load factor and how they use electricity versus their production. Do they ever compare that to their production? Because you can see if there's a variance from what your production is and what your electricity, you could see, hey, I'm using more electricity than I should be based on my operation. Certainly financial people, and this is, John, we can get into this too, because you're exposed to accounting personally in your household. I find a lot of times accountants when they're budgeting, they do a budget for the year for electricity or natural gas. They don't track variances because they don't track consumption. And so in my view, financial people should have a monthly budget based on consumption and pricing and track that, which I don't think is done that often. So in summary, there's different people that should get access to different information and be able to sign off and be aware of how that impacts their position. I think I went down a different place, John. Feel free to bring us back.
I think you're good there. Okay. One of the things I'm going to bring up, and it's quite interesting, and I'll bring it up. Well, here's the thing. It's quite interesting if you're inspired by this and it matters to you. If you're not, you're thinking, what's he going on about? But anyway, one of the things that becomes interesting when you're doing this external building up a picture of somebody for reporting, and you find there's a missing invoice. And so you go back to the client and you say, this is when you get it wrong. You say, oh, I need June's electricity invoice. And what you end up with is the one that the accountants think is the one payable in June. And it may
Right.
not
Which is
necessarily
the
be
last
the
month.
one that covers the consumption in June, because you're billed afterwards. So there can be a very simple misunderstanding of what the data relates to, because the accountant tends to put the money into the month that it goes out of the company, which will be the month after you've used it if you're on monthly billing. Doesn't sound much, but it complicates matter. And then I'm sorry to say, we've got to come back to this real problem. How do you get the information off the bills into the system? Now, this probably doesn't happen so much now, but when we had physical paper bills, the one thing that really wound me up is this would, I was saying, oh, page 1 is the one the accountants look at. They would go then and put a sticker on page 2 with all their notes on it, covering up the information that you wanted off that page. So that doesn't happen so much now, but it does come round to this thing, and there needs to be a solution. There are solutions, but guess what? I don't think utility companies globally are helping us as much as they could with this, because in an ideal environment, you would have a uniform data format for an electronic invoice for utilities that anybody could use, and then just suck the data straight off that into your system. It seems to me where we're going is that utilities have got up the idea we can have e-paper, typically a PDF, and that's good. And so then we get into this concept of data scraping, and you've touched on the accuracy of this, Dave, but that's the next stage that's needed. How do you accurately get that off? And how does that become complicated? Because every utility lays the bill out differently, and that's one of the reasons why you have problems in getting it. It's why people have problems dealing with bills. If you're sat down as, shall we say, the person responsible for reviewing the utility bills for a global organization, I mean, you don't even have one format for one country. And I mean, even within one province or one state, you probably haven't got a uniform format. So we still have this problem. We've got this absolutely invaluable information, that's this transaction that you've made for the energy that you've got. And how do you get that accurately and effectively into this monstrous great sustainability reporting system you've got?
Okay, so this is a 25-minute one for sure, Lysandra. So I want to come back to the accuracy again, because what will happen if when customers put the information down or they capture this, whether optically or whatever, invariably utilities do corrections. And they will make modifications to past bills.
Yes.
And I've seen in California a 122-page correction for the last year.
Wow.
And clients have no concept of what that means to what they already recorded. So, and there's Alberta, for example, a province in Canada, they can change their bill 5 months, up to 5 months. So they can change each month 5 times to get the bill correct. Okay? So now we're just giving you the reasons why people struggle with utility bills. But I want to come back to what John said, because I think the 22 things that we look at are consistent. It doesn't matter worldwide. Like for electricity bill, there's key things that need to look at. We have been and still are, and John's already talked about this, if the utility industry developed a standard where there's a universal report that actually captures critical data, it doesn't matter if you're in the UK or if in British Columbia or Nova Scotia or California, there's critical content. If that information was put into a format, and I'm going to say to you, because we have addressed this, in a QR code that a customer could easily scan and suck into a database with pure accuracy, that would solve the biggest problem of capturing data with pure accuracy without and it would be fast. It would be really efficient. So I want to mention this. Customers, if they're hand bombing this information, it takes 9 to 10 minutes per invoice. We've timed it. We've asked people to do it. No one has the time or energy to do that these days. And so that's probably one of the reasons why, one of many, of why people don't do it. So if this data was put into a format in a QR code, which was consistent, doesn't matter what you are, where you are located, and it's consistent, and it was sucked into a database for the organization, it would be so much easier, and I would say to you, energy is controllable. Last point. We have discussed this in nausea around Canada. In fact, we developed a national group to actually discuss this. I want you to know that everyone thinks it's a fantastic idea. The only people that have stopped that thinking is utility people. And the reasons are, the energy boards won't accept it, and so if we can get over this hurdle, I think it would start making energy more controllable. Okay, I'm getting off my pedestal now, John. You started me up on that one. I thought it's a good one to have.
I'm going to run with it with a bit, because one of the things that you're so right. I had it the other day. I was going through an annual set of invoices for annual carbon reporting for a client, and I suddenly thought, "What? This is odd. I've got 18 invoices for 12 months." Well, of course, what it was, there were invoices, credit notes, and new invoices, and things like that, adding it all up, which really does complicate matters for you no end in understanding that. But I actually want to take us down another rabbit hole in this conversation, and I touched on it earlier, and it was estimated readings. What we need globally is smart metering. If that, I'll use that as a shorthand for it, but online metering. Not one where the guy turns up, the security guard's on the gate and says, "Sorry, mate, you can't go in there. I can't open that up for you." So he goes back to his van, scribbles figure in, off he goes. Or they, as we said, they use some kind of modelling, and the usual model that they will do is, what was the profile last year? We'll model against that for this year. And sometimes these estimated readings go under the wire. But if you've got smart interval reading, this gets interesting then. One, you should get more accurate billing. Two, you've then got accessibility to interval data, be it 15 or 30 minutes or whatever your jurisdiction is. Now we're talking an Excel CSV file that you can manipulate, you can do things with. It really is valuable. So here's our agenda then. What we want uniformity of billing. And two, we want all utilities at no cost to the customer to put in smart or online metering. That's my manifesto.
Fair enough.
Vote for me.
All right. So we talked about why acquiring energy and carbon data is crucial for businesses. We talked about what hurdles businesses face, what are some procedural issues. Now last, how does the analysis of energy and carbon data from Invoices drive operational improvements and help facilitate the implementation of eco-friendly initiatives within organizations?
Okay,
I'll start this.
You're going to go first, Dave? Go on.
Well, okay. So think about this. If no one has any knowledge or understanding of how they use energy, if there's no awareness, and there isn't, why would you ever manage it? Right?
Yep.
And so if you can get time-stamped oriented data, like monthly bill data, that it relates to a month that you worked in, at least you have an understanding of, wow, I used that amount of energy, but our production was this, or our occupancy was this, or you're not going to do anything unless you have a related to a timestamp area that has related to the work or things that you're doing. The second thing is, this information, I think I touched upon it before, this information is really helpful for a variety of different disciplines in the work they do. Again, they never get this data. They never get, and maybe they don't even know how to use it, even if they did get it. So having this information, and I'm talking about energy data, it's sort of, it gives you kind of a status, a benchmark of where you are. And then when you start making changes on the energy or on the carbon emission side, you can literally see the impact that you're having or not having. And that's just as important to reinforce what you need to do going forward or stop doing because you thought you were making changes and wasn't doing. So it's really essential that this information becomes transparent, understandable, and that organizations start using it. And when they do, because, so just a deep, dark secret for all our listeners, John and I started this company called Energy Information Systems up in 1995. So that's, if you think we're passionate about it, it's because we actually know how important this information is. When clients get data and they understand it, and by the way, they're held accountable, great things happen. You'll see measurable improvements that go right to the bottom line. John, over to you.
I'm just going to give a controversial answer, just to stir things up a bit. So, how does the analysis and all this? How does it drive organisational improvement on its own? Because if you haven't got a system in place, a team in place, if you're not doing it, you will actually have spent a lot of money getting all this data and doing nothing with it. It will actually, reduce your performance because you're spending effort where it's not required. But if you have got a team in place that's looking at energy and carbon, the basic fuel, one of the basic fuels that team needs is accurate, reliable, dependable data that tracks performance. And that's where we're coming from.
And John, kidding aside, you and I both know, we know of organizations that actually collect this data, but no one uses it.
Yeah.
We see this often. So
it's as if holding the data gives you some kind of power.
Honestly, listening to this episode along with our listeners, something I do want to emphasize is, again, the data should not be looked at in silos. Like, I know we kind of really emphasize making sure you're looking at the data, you're getting the data is accurate. But now that your data is accurate, what are you doing with it, right? So I think it's really important to be analyzing your operations. Things to look at, obviously, are any anomalies. So things like your peaks, but also don't underestimate looking at your baseline non-operational things as well. Because oftentimes, even just because you see that something is consistent doesn't mean it's correct. Your baseline could be the same, every single day for 8 hours a day, but that may not be, an excuse to not look at it. There's still things that you can find in regular data that can be incorrect. So I know that, we've had conversations with clients where, we didn't know this one thing was running all the time because, again, it's consistently running and we didn't know that. So I think it's really important to look at your operation, and something that Dave and John both emphasized is talking with your team. So it's not just about talking to, one person. It's getting on that shop floor, understanding what they're using, understanding the hours they're using it, and making sure that translate to the utility data and translate to your hourly consumption, your monthly consumption, your weekly consumption. So I think, the importance of accurate data is great, but also taking the accurate data back and making sure it's actually accurate to your operations and what you should be using.
And Lysandra, one thing we failed to mention is it's great information for a single site and for sites to get. But corporately, it actually is really helpful to benchmark different sites. It can be used to, figure out future production, where growth is going to happen. Maybe possible areas of management activity has to change because of some of the information you're getting. So it is invaluable. It just needs to be understood by a variety of people within an organization for sure.
Well, to end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is I could not talk about this in 20 minutes. It was effectively 40. No. I think, seriously, the biggest takeaway is if you want to, and I believe this is going to happen because just the way the world's going, if you want to start managing energy, and you will, sooner or later, will need to start managing energy, the first place to start is to look and use utility bills and understand how to use utility bills.
John?
if we're trying to keep it short, I'm going to say ditto, the same. But no, let's just go for it just slightly longer. You've mentioned about single site, multi-site. Here's the thing. If you're not going to invest a lot of money and you've got multiple sites, every one of them has got utility meters. So at a site level, you've got measurement. Every one of them should have somebody who takes responsibility for that supply, and that someone can look at that one utility bill. And if they understand how to read that bill, they can start working towards doing something. So I think, if we were putting people through energy and carbon boot camp, it would be the utility bill is a great starting point. It isn't always accurate, but if you don't understand it and you don't look at it, you won't know how accurate it is and you won't be able to use it.
That's a great summary, John. And quite frankly, I think you just nailed why nothing happens, because there's that literacy issue and not getting the access to information. Yeah. So, great summary.
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway is if you don't start, you'll never get anywhere. So although this may seem like a big thing, start with one invoice. And as you ask the questions and as you maybe catch some errors, you will get the appetite to tackle everything else.
Yeah, you've got to start the journey.
Right. Thanks, Dave and John, for a great episode.
Thanks, Lysandra. Thanks, John.
I'm sorry we couldn't find enough to talk about.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.